In ancient times, punishment for crime was harsh and direct. There were no long trials or prisons as we know them today. When someone broke the law, punishment was meant to restore order, create fear, and prevent others from doing the same. Each empire punished crime according to its values. Some used strict discipline, others relied on written laws, public shame, forced labor, or religious authority. Crime was often seen as a threat to society, the ruler, or even the gods themselves. Punishment was usually public, swift, and final, reminding everyone that order mattered more than individual mercy. Subscribe to the channel now, and let's get started. Number 1. Spartan hegemony. In ancient Greece, there was a city where fear was not regarded as a weakness, but as a necessary instrument of survival. A society where discipline was valued above mercy and obedience was considered more important than personal desire. This city was Sparta. Sparta stood apart from every other Greek city-state. While Athens became famous for philosophy, debate, theater, and art, Sparta deliberately rejected those paths. It chose instead to shape itself into a permanent military camp. Every law, tradition, and social custom existed for one purpose alone: to create a population capable of defending and dominating the state at any cost. By the 5th century BCE, Sparta had risen to become one of the most powerful forces in the Greek world. Its reputation was built not only on battlefield success, but on its internal discipline. Other Greek cities feared Spartan armies, but they also feared the Spartan system itself, a society so tightly controlled that rebellion from within seemed almost impossible. Political power in Sparta was carefully divided. 2 kings ruled simultaneously, supported by a council of elders and overseen by officials known as ephors. These institutions were designed to prevent individual ambition from weakening the state. No single ruler was above the law, but the law itself was unforgiving. Justice in Sparta was not concerned with personal rights or moral intention. It was concerned with maintaining order, unity, and readiness for war. From the moment a child was born, Spartan authority made itself known. Infants were examined for physical strength. Those judged too weak or unhealthy were removed from society. Those allowed to live entered a world of strict supervision. Childhood was not a time of protection or comfort. It was preparation. Spartan boys were raised through a state-controlled system that emphasized endurance, silence, obedience, and toughness. Hunger, exposure, and hardship were intentional. These conditions were meant to strip away fear and hesitation. Emotional expression was discouraged. Individual ambition was suppressed. The ideal Spartan citizen was one who obeyed without question and endured without complaint. Within this system, crime was defined very differently than in most societies. Theft, deception, or personal disputes were of little concern unless they threatened the stability of the state. The most serious offense in Sparta was weakness. Cowardice in battle, failure during training, or disobedience to authority were considered crimes against the entire community. Punishment in Sparta was not designed to rehabilitate the offender. It was designed to protect the system. Discipline was enforced openly and deliberately. Public shame played a central role. A Spartan who failed expectations could be stripped of honor and treated as a disgrace. He might be excluded from communal meals, denied the right to participate in rituals, or forced to live in social isolation. In a society where identity was entirely collective, such exclusion was devastating. Loss of honor followed a man everywhere. Others were instructed not to associate with him. Marriage became difficult or impossible. Daily life itself became a reminder of failure. These punishments were not accidental. They were calculated to reinforce obedience among those who remained. For soldiers, discipline was even harsher. Spartan military training was relentless, and commanders were granted wide authority to punish disobedience or hesitation. Pain was considered a tool of instruction. Endurance was proof of loyalty. A soldier was expected to suffer silently, believing that personal pain strengthened the state as a whole. These punishments were not acts of uncontrolled violence. They followed tradition and expectation. Every Spartan understood the consequences of failure long before facing them. Fear was not hidden from society, and it was taught. Beneath Spartan citizens lived the helots, an enslaved population that worked the land and sustained the economy. The helots vastly outnumbered the Spartan ruling class, and this imbalance created constant anxiety. The Spartan state ruled the helots through intimidation and terror. Any sign of resistance was met with severe punishment. These actions were carried out publicly, serving as warnings to others. There was little distinction between military authority and civilian law in Sparta. The state itself acted as judge, jury, and enforcer. Compassion was viewed as dangerous. Mercy was believed to weaken discipline. Justice existed only to preserve order and prevent collapse. Religion reinforced this system. Spartan beliefs taught that discipline and obedience pleased the gods, while weakness endangered the entire community. Punishment was therefore not only legal, but moral in Spartan eyes. To suffer for the state was considered honorable. To fail, it was shameful. To modern observers, Spartan punishment appears harsh, inflexible, and deeply cruel. Individual freedom barely existed. Personal expression was suppressed. Yet for centuries, the system endured. It produced one of the most disciplined military societies the ancient world had ever seen. Sparta's justice was never about fairness in the modern sense. It was about survival. Punishment was not merely a response to wrongdoing. It was a constant reminder that belonging came at a price, and that the state always came first. In Sparta, fear was not hidden in the shadows. It stood openly at the center of society, shaping every life that passed beneath its rule. Number 2. Celtic empires. Across much of ancient Europe, long before centralized states and written law codes became common, the Celtic world developed its own powerful systems of authority, justice, and punishment. Stretching from the British Isles through Gaul and into parts of Iberia and Central Europe, Celtic societies were diverse, yet bound together by shared traditions, beliefs, and values. Their idea of punishment did not grow from imperial bureaucracy or standing armies, but from honor, custom, and communal balance. Unlike Sparta or Rome, the Celtic empires were not ruled by a single emperor or unified government. Power was decentralized, resting in tribes led by kings or chieftains. These rulers were not absolute monarchs. Their authority depended on reputation, bravery, generosity, and the support of the people. Justice, therefore, was not imposed from above by an impersonal state, but enforced through tradition and social obligation. At the heart of Celtic justice stood the Druids. More than priests, Druids served as judges, legal scholars, teachers, and keepers of tradition. They memorized laws, customs, and precedents, passing them orally from generation to generation. Written law was rare. Memory and ritual carried authority. When a crime occurred, it was often the Druid who interpreted tradition and determined the proper response. Crime in Celtic society was not viewed primarily as an offense against the state, but as a disruption of balance within the community. Theft, violence, broken oaths, or dishonor harmed not only the victim, but the stability of the tribe itself. The purpose of punishment was not cruelty, but restoration. Justice sought to heal social wounds and reaffirm shared values. One of the most common forms of punishment was compensation. Offenders were often required to repay victims through livestock, weapons, land, or precious goods. These payments were carefully measured according to the severity of the offense and the social status of those involved. A crime against a noble demanded greater compensation than one against a commoner. Honor had value, and that value could be calculated. Exile was another powerful punishment in the Celtic world. To be cast out of one's tribe meant losing protection, identity, and survival itself. Celtic life depended on kinship and mutual defense. An exiled individual became vulnerable to enemies, starvation, and isolation. This punishment carried deep psychological weight and served as a strong deterrent against serious wrongdoing. Public shame also played a significant role. Reputation mattered deeply in Celtic culture. A warrior's honor defined his place in society. Criminals could be publicly condemned, mocked, or stripped of status. Songs, stories, and memory preserved these judgments long after formal punishment ended. Shame followed a person for life. For serious crimes such as betrayal, repeated violence, or sacrilege, harsher punishments were possible. Kings and tribal councils could authorize execution, particularly if an offender threatened the survival of the tribe. These decisions were not taken lightly. Because authority depended on consent, unjust punishment risked rebellion or loss of loyalty. Warfare influenced Celtic justice as well. Warriors were held to strict codes of courage and loyalty. Cowardice in battle or betrayal of comrades was considered a grave dishonor. Punishment in these cases often involved exclusion from warrior society, loss of weapons, or public humiliation. A warrior without honor was no warrior at all. Religion deeply shaped Celtic punishment. Crimes against sacred spaces, rituals, or oaths sworn before the gods were treated with extreme seriousness. Such offenses were believed to anger divine forces and bring disaster upon the community. Punishment, therefore, served not only social order, but spiritual protection. Justice was a sacred duty. Unlike rigid empires, Celtic societies allowed flexibility. Judges considered intent, circumstance, and reconciliation. Mercy was possible if balance could be restored. This did not mean weakness. It meant understanding that survival depended on unity more than fear. To modern observers, Celtic justice may appear informal or inconsistent, yet it functioned effectively for centuries. It maintained order without prisons, bureaucracy, or standing police forces. Punishment relied on shared belief, memory, and honor, rather than constant violence. In the Celtic world, punishment was not meant to dominate the individual. It was meant to remind everyone of their place within the living web of tribe, land, ancestors, and gods. Justice was communal, personal, and deeply human. Number 3. Aztec Empire. In the heart of ancient Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire rose as one of the most powerful and highly organized states of the pre-Columbian world. Centered on the great city of Tenochtitlan, built on islands in Lake Texcoco, the Aztecs created a society where law, punishment, religion, and power were inseparably linked. Justice in the Aztec world was not merely a human institution, it was believed to reflect the will of the gods themselves. Unlike decentralized tribal societies, the Aztec Empire possessed a strong central authority. At its peak, it ruled millions of people through a combination of military strength, tribute, and strict legal control. The emperor, known as the Huitlatawani, stood at the top of this system. Beneath him operated a hierarchy of judges, officials, and military commanders who enforced the law throughout the empire. Aztec law was highly structured and surprisingly detailed. Courts existed in major cities, and judges were trained officials, not priests or warriors acting on impulse. Legal cases could be appealed to higher courts, and even nobles were expected to obey the law. However, equality before the law did not mean leniency. Aztec justice was severe by design. Crime in the Aztec Empire was viewed as a threat to social and cosmic order. The Aztecs believed the universe itself was fragile, requiring constant balance between humans and the gods. Disorder among the people risked divine punishment in the form of famine, disease, or defeat. For this reason, punishment was strict, public, and intended to deter wrongdoing. Common crimes included theft, drunkenness, adultery, corruption, disobedience, and failure to meet social duties. Many offenses that might be considered private matters in other societies were treated as serious crimes in Aztec law. Behavior reflected not only on the individual, but on the stability of the empire. Punishment varied depending on the crime and the social status of the offender. While nobles were theoretically held to higher standards, their punishments were often harsher because their failures were seen as more damaging. A noble who committed a serious crime could face the same fate as a commoner, or worse, because his actions betrayed public trust. Public punishment played a central role in Aztec justice. Criminals were often punished in ways that were visible to the community. These punishments served as warnings and reinforced the authority of the state. Fear was an intentional element of the legal system, not an accidental byproduct. Enslavement was a common punishment for certain crimes. A convicted person could lose personal freedom and be forced into labor. This form of punishment reinforced social hierarchy and provided economic benefit to the state and elites. In some cases, criminals could be sold or assigned to serve temples or noble households. Military discipline was especially strict. Soldiers were expected to obey orders without hesitation. Desertion, cowardice, or disobedience during war was treated as a serious offense. Military punishment reinforced loyalty and ensured the effectiveness of Aztec armies, which were essential for expansion and tribute collection. Religion deeply influenced punishment in the Aztec Empire. Crimes against temples, priests, or sacred rituals were treated with extreme seriousness. The Aztecs believed that law-breaking could anger the gods, threatening the survival of the entire society. Punishment, therefore, served both legal and religious purposes. Aztec justice did not rely on long-term imprisonment. Prisons existed mainly as temporary holding places. Punishment was usually swift, decisive, and final. This approach minimized uncertainty and reinforced the authority of the law. Children and youth were also subject to punishment. Aztec society believed discipline must begin early. Young people were taught obedience, restraint, and respect through strict upbringing. Failure to follow social norms was corrected firmly, reinforcing the idea that order must be learned before adulthood. Despite its severity, Aztec law was systematic rather than chaotic. Judges were expected to act fairly within the framework of the law. Corrupt judges could themselves be punished. The goal was not arbitrary cruelty, but control, deterrence, and stability. To modern observers, Aztec punishment may appear harsh and uncompromising. Yet within the Aztec worldview, it was necessary. Justice maintained social order, reinforced religious belief, and upheld imperial power. The system allowed the empire to govern vast territories with limited administrative resources. In the Aztec Empire, punishment was more than a response to crime. It was a public statement of authority, a religious obligation, and a tool of empire. Law reminded every citizen that order was sacred, obedience was expected, and disorder carried consequences. Number 4. Maya civilization. Across the dense jungles and limestone plains of Mesoamerica, the Maya civilization developed one of the most complex and enduring societies of the ancient world. Flourishing for centuries across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, the Maya were not a single empire ruled by one king, but a network of powerful city-states. Each city was governed by its own ruler, laws, and traditions, yet they shared common beliefs about order, authority, and punishment. In Maya society, justice was deeply connected to religion, social rank, and the authority of the ruler, known as the Ajah. The Ajah was more than a political leader. He was believed to be chosen by the gods, responsible for maintaining harmony between the human world and the divine. When crime occurred, it was not merely a violation of human law, but a disruption of cosmic balance. Unlike later civilizations with written legal codes carved in stone, Maya law was enforced through custom, tradition, and royal decree. Judges were often nobles appointed by the ruler, and their authority came from both political power and religious legitimacy. Law was not abstract or distant. It was personal, visible, and closely tied to status. Social class played a crucial role in how justice was applied. Maya society was hierarchical. Nobles, priests, warriors, commoners, and enslaved people all lived under different expectations. Punishment was not equal for everyone. In many cases, elites were held to stricter standards because their behavior was believed to set an example for the entire city. A noble who committed a serious crime could face severe consequences, not because he was powerless, but because his failure was seen as a betrayal of divine trust. Common crimes in Maya society included theft, adultery, disobedience to authority, damage to property, and offenses against religious practices. Crimes were often handled quickly without long trials or imprisonment. The goal of punishment was to restore order and reaffirm the authority of the ruler. Compensation was a common form of punishment for lesser offenses. A thief, for example, might be required to repay the victim through goods, labor, or service. If the offender could not provide compensation, he could be forced into temporary servitude. This system ensured that harm was addressed directly and that victims were not ignored. For more serious crimes, punishment became far stricter. Adultery was considered a grave offense because it threatened family structure and inheritance. Severe penalties were imposed, especially when the crime involved members of the elite. Public punishment served as a warning to others and reinforced moral boundaries. Religion strongly influenced Maya justice. The Maya believed the gods constantly observed human behavior. Crimes against temples, rituals, or sacred objects were treated with exceptional seriousness. Such offenses risked angering the gods, potentially bringing drought, famine, or military defeat upon the city. Punishment, therefore, was not only legal, but spiritual, aimed at preventing divine retribution. Public visibility was an important aspect of punishment. Justice was meant to be seen and remembered. Public rituals, ceremonies, and announcements reinforced the idea that the ruler maintained control and that the gods supported the legal order. Shame was a powerful deterrent in a society where reputation and family honor mattered deeply. Unlike some ancient societies, the Maya made limited use of long-term imprisonment. Confinement was usually temporary, serving as a holding measure before punishment was decided. Justice was swift, reinforcing the idea that order must be restored quickly to prevent chaos. Warfare also shaped Maya punishment practices. Captured enemies could be punished in ways that reinforced military dominance and religious belief noted in inscriptions and artwork. These acts were intended to demonstrate power, intimidate rivals, and reaffirm the ruler's connection to the divine. Children were taught discipline from an early age. Education emphasized obedience, respect, and endurance. Misbehavior was corrected firmly, reinforcing the belief that social order depended on early instruction. Discipline was not seen as cruelty, but as preparation for adult responsibility. Despite its severity, Maya justice was not entirely inflexible. Rulers could show mercy, especially if reconciliation benefited social stability. Forgiveness was possible, but only when it reinforced authority rather than weakened it. Justice served the city, not the individual. To modern observers, Maya punishment may seem harsh and unequal. Yet within the Maya worldview, it was necessary. Law protected harmony between humans, rulers, ancestors, and gods. Punishment reminded everyone of their place in the universe and the consequences of disorder. The Maya civilization endured for centuries, not because it was gentle, but because its system of authority, belief, and justice maintained balance in a fragile world. Punishment was not simply about crime. It was about preserving cosmic order, reinforcing divine kingship, and ensuring survival in a challenging environment. Number 5. Roman Empire. The Roman Empire stands as one of the most influential political systems in human history, not only for the territories it conquered, but for the way it defined law, authority, and punishment. From a small city on the banks of the Tiber River, Rome expanded into a vast empire stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. To govern such immense diversity, Rome developed one of the most structured and deliberate systems of justice the ancient world had ever seen. Unlike societies where law was tied primarily to religion or tribal custom, Roman punishment was rooted in written law, civic duty, and state authority. Roman leaders believed that order was the foundation of civilization. Without discipline, the empire would collapse under its own weight. Punishment, therefore, was not only a response to crime, but a visible symbol of Roman power. Roman law evolved over centuries. Early traditions were shaped by custom. But as Rome expanded, laws became formalized, recorded, and enforced by officials. Magistrates, judges, governors, and military commanders all held authority to punish. The emperor stood above them all, serving as the ultimate source of justice. His word could override courts, laws, and tradition. Crime in the Roman world was defined broadly. Theft, fraud, assault, corruption, desertion, rebellion, and treason were all treated seriously. Crimes were classified based on severity and social status. Roman society was hierarchical, and punishment reflected this structure. Citizens, non-citizens, enslaved people, and soldiers were all subject to different legal standards. For Roman citizens, the law offered certain protections. Trials, legal representation, and appeals were possible, especially during the Republic and early Empire. However, these protections were not guarantees of mercy. Convicted citizens could face heavy fines, exile, forced labor, or death, depending on the crime. Exile was a particularly powerful punishment, stripping a person of home, identity, and political life. Non-citizens and enslaved people faced far harsher treatment. The law viewed them as property or subjects rather than participants in civic life. Punishment for these groups was swift and severe, often carried out without formal trial. The Roman legal system was efficient but deeply unequal. Public punishment played a central role in Roman justice. Executions, corporal punishment, and forced labor were often conducted in public spaces. These acts were meant to educate the population through fear. Roman authorities believed that visible punishment prevented disorder more effectively than private correction. Justice was meant to be seen. Imprisonment in Rome was not a long-term sentence as it is today. Prisons existed mainly to hold the accused before trial or punishment. True punishment was final and decisive. Forced labor in mines, quarries, or state projects was a common sentence for serious crimes, especially for non-citizens. These punishments removed offenders from society while benefiting the empire economically. Military discipline within the Roman Empire was especially strict. Soldiers were bound by a separate legal code. Disobedience, desertion, cowardice, or mutiny were treated as grave crimes. Commanders had the authority to punish soldiers immediately. Discipline was essential to maintaining Rome's military dominance, and fear was used to enforce loyalty. One of the most feared punishments in the Roman army was collective discipline. Entire units could be punished for the actions of a few. This reinforced unity and mutual responsibility. The message was clear: survival depended on obedience. Religion also influenced Roman punishment, though differently than in the Maya or Aztec worlds. Crimes against temples, rituals, or sacred offices were punished not only as legal offenses, but as acts of impiety. The Romans believed that angering the gods endangered the state. Justice served both human and divine order. Political crime was among the most dangerous offenses in Rome. Treason, conspiracy, and rebellion were punished with extreme severity. As emperors gained more power, accusations of political disloyalty became tools of control. Punishment reinforced the idea that loyalty to Rome and the emperor was absolute. Despite its harshness, Roman law prized order and procedure. Judges were expected to follow legal norms. Corruption was itself a crime. Officials who abused their authority could be punished, especially when public trust was threatened. Law was both a weapon and a structure holding the empire together. Family authority also played a role in punishment. Roman fathers held legal power over their households, including the right to discipline family members. This private authority mirrored the broader power of the state, reinforcing obedience from the smallest unit of society upward. Children were taught respect for law early. Education emphasized duty, discipline, and loyalty. Moral instruction reinforced legal authority, creating citizens who accepted punishment as a natural consequence of disorder. To modern observers, Roman punishment appears severe, unequal, and often brutal. Yet within Roman ideology, it was justified. The empire believed that peace, prosperity, and civilization required strict control. Law separated Romans from what they viewed as chaos. The Roman system endured for centuries because it adapted. Laws evolved, procedures changed, and authority shifted. But the core principle remained the same. Order must be enforced, and punishment was the price of stability. In the Roman Empire, justice was not gentle. It was deliberate, public, and uncompromising. Punishment reminded every subject, citizen or not, that Rome ruled through law backed by power, and that disobedience carried consequences. Number 6. Macedonian Empire. The Macedonian Empire emerged from a rugged and often underestimated corner of the Greek world, yet in a single generation it reshaped the political and cultural landscape of 3 continents. From the reign of Philip II to the conquests of his son Alexander the Great, Macedonia transformed from a regional kingdom into one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever known. With this rapid expansion came a system of authority and punishment, shaped not by long-established institutions, but by military command, royal will, and the constant demands of conquest. Unlike Rome, which developed its laws over centuries, the Macedonian Empire expanded at extraordinary speed. Its justice system was therefore less bureaucratic and more personal. Authority flowed directly from the king. Law, punishment, and command were inseparable, especially during military campaigns. Loyalty was the foundation of order, and betrayal was the greatest crime. Philip II had already begun reshaping Macedonia into a disciplined military state. He centralized power, weakened rival nobles, and reorganized the army. Under his rule, punishment became a tool to enforce unity and obedience. Nobles who resisted royal authority could be stripped of power, exiled, or eliminated. The message was clear. The state came before personal ambition. When Alexander the Great ascended the throne, punishment became even more closely tied to military discipline. Alexander ruled not only as king, but as supreme commander. His empire was constantly on the move, stretching from Greece to Egypt, Persia, and into Central Asia. In such conditions, hesitation, disobedience, or dissent threatened the survival of the entire force. Military law dominated Macedonian justice. Soldiers were bound by strict expectations of loyalty, courage, and obedience. Disobedience during battle, desertion, or failure to follow orders could result in immediate punishment. Commanders acted as judges, and trials were often held before assembled troops. Justice was public, swift, and intended to reinforce discipline. Punishment within the army served a psychological purpose. Soldiers were expected to witness the consequences of failure. Fear was used deliberately, not as chaos, but as control. At the same time, loyalty was rewarded, reinforcing the idea that obedience brought honor, while resistance brought ruin. Civilian justice within the Macedonian Empire was less uniform. As Alexander conquered new territories, he often allowed local customs and laws to remain in place, so long as they did not threaten his authority. However, crimes against Macedonian rule were treated with extreme severity. Rebellion, conspiracy, or refusal to submit to royal command were punished decisively. One of the defining features of Macedonian punishment was its personal nature. Alexander frequently acted as judge himself. His decisions were final. While he could show mercy, especially when it served political stability, he could also be unforgiving. Punishment reflected the king's judgment of loyalty rather than adherence to an abstract legal code. Nobles and high-ranking officers were not immune. In fact, they were often punished more harshly because their actions carried greater consequences. Conspiracies within the court were treated as existential threats. When trusted companions were accused of betrayal, punishment served as a warning to all others that proximity to power did not grant safety. Public trials were sometimes held before the army, reinforcing collective responsibility and loyalty. These proceedings emphasized that the empire was sustained by unity under the king. Individual rights were secondary to imperial survival. Religion and kingship also influenced punishment. Alexander presented himself not merely as a ruler, but as a figure favored by the gods. Crimes against the king could therefore be framed as offenses against divine order. Punishment reinforced the idea that obedience to Alexander was both political and sacred. As the empire expanded eastward, Alexander adopted elements of Persian royal tradition, including absolute authority over life and death. This shift caused tension among Macedonian officers accustomed to earlier customs. Resistance to these changes was met with firm punishment, demonstrating that tradition would not override royal command. Civil populations experienced punishment differently depending on their response to Macedonian rule. Cities that surrendered peacefully were often treated leniently, retaining autonomy under Macedonian oversight. Those that resisted faced severe consequences. Punishment in these cases was designed to deter further rebellion and accelerate submission. Unlike later empires, the Macedonian state did not rely on prisons or long legal processes. Punishment was immediate and final. This reflected both the military nature of the empire and the realities of constant movement. Justice needed to be decisive to maintain control. Alexander's personal temperament also shaped punishment. He was capable of generosity and mercy, but also of swift anger. His justice was not impersonal. It reflected emotion, loyalty, and perceived threat. This unpredictability reinforced fear, ensuring obedience, but also creating instability within the elite. As the empire grew, maintaining discipline became increasingly difficult. Cultural differences, long campaigns, and exhaustion strained loyalty. Punishment became harsher as resistance grew. Fear replaced shared identity as the glue holding the empire together. After Alexander's death, the empire fractured almost immediately. Without his personal authority, the system of punishment he enforced could not survive. His generals, the Diadochi, turned against one another, each imposing their own systems of control. This collapse revealed a central truth of Macedonian justice. It depended entirely on the presence of a powerful king. To modern observers, Macedonian punishment appears harsh, personal, and unstable. There were no consistent rights, no enduring legal institutions. Yet for a brief moment in history, it worked. Discipline, fear, and loyalty allowed a relatively small kingdom to dominate much of the known world. In the Macedonian Empire, punishment was not about law. It was about command. Justice did not flow from institutions but from the will of the king. Order was maintained not through tradition or bureaucracy, but through loyalty enforced by fear. The empire's rise and fall reveal both the power and the limits of such a system. It could conquer the world, but it could not outlive the man who commanded it. Number 7. Athenian Empire. The Athenian Empire emerged from a city that believed law, reason, and public debate were the foundations of civilization. Unlike Sparta, which ruled through discipline and fear, Athens claimed to rule through law, participation, and the voice of its citizens. Yet beneath this ideal lay a system of punishment that was firm, public, and deeply political. Justice in Athens was not administered by kings or generals alone, but by the people themselves. And that made punishment both powerful and unpredictable. Athens rose to dominance in the 5th century BCE, following its victories against Persia. What began as a defensive alliance of Greek city-states, known as the Delian League, gradually transformed into an Athenian empire. Tribute flowed into Athens, its navy controlled the seas, and its democratic institutions expanded alongside imperial power. As Athens grew stronger, so did the need to enforce order, both within the city and across its subject states. Unlike most ancient societies, Athens placed legal authority in the hands of its citizens. There was no professional police force, no permanent judges, and no single ruler who dictated justice. Instead, large citizen juries decided guilt and punishment. Any adult male citizen could serve as a juror. Law was public, participatory, and deeply woven into everyday life. Crime in Athens was defined not only as harm to individuals, but as harm to the community and the democracy itself. Theft, assault, corruption, impiety, and political misconduct were all taken seriously. Crimes against the state, such as treason or attempts to undermine democracy, were among the most severe offenses. Justice was inseparable from politics. Punishment in Athens served multiple purposes. It punished wrongdoing, protected democratic order, and reinforced civic values. Trials were public events, often attended by large crowds. Speeches, arguments, and appeals to emotion were central. There were no lawyers in the modern sense. Citizens spoke for themselves. Verdicts were decided quickly without prolonged deliberation. Athenian punishments ranged widely. Fines were common, especially for economic crimes or minor offenses. Failure to pay fines could result in loss of citizenship rights. Exile was another powerful punishment, removing individuals from the political life of the city. One unique Athenian practice was ostracism, a political process through which citizens could vote to exile a person they believed posed a threat to democracy, even without a formal crime. Loss of civic rights was a serious penalty. A citizen could be barred from speaking in the assembly, voting, or holding office. In a society where political participation defined identity, this punishment was devastating. It turned a citizen into a silent observer within his own city. Imprisonment was rare and usually temporary. Athens did not rely on long-term incarceration. Punishment was meant to be decisive. For serious crimes, execution was a legal outcome, carried out according to established procedures. These acts were viewed not as cruelty, but as necessary to protect the community. Religion played a major role in Athenian justice. Impiety, showing disrespect to the gods, sacred rituals, or temples, was considered a serious crime. Athenians believed divine favor protected the city. Crimes that offended the gods endangered everyone. Punishment, therefore, served both civic and spiritual purposes. Slaves and non-citizens experienced Athenian justice differently. They had limited legal protections and could be punished more harshly. Slaves were often subjected to physical punishment, while citizens were not. The law reflected Athens' belief in equality among citizens, but not equality for all people. Imperial power added another layer to Athenian punishment. Subject cities that resisted Athenian authority could be punished collectively. Tribute could be increased, local leaders removed, or autonomy reduced. Punishment in these cases was meant to deter rebellion and preserve control over the empire. Military discipline also influenced Athenian justice. Generals were held accountable for failures. Unlike in Sparta or Macedonia, even top commanders could be put on trial. Defeat, poor judgment, or political unpopularity could lead to punishment, exile, or execution. This reflected Athens' belief that no individual was above the law, but it also revealed the dangers of popular justice driven by emotion. To modern observers, Athenian punishment appears contradictory. Athens promoted freedom of speech, yet punished dissent harshly when it threatened the state. It celebrated equality, yet enforced strict social boundaries. Justice was democratic, but not always fair by modern standards. Despite these contradictions, Athenian justice shaped the future of law. The idea that citizens should judge citizens, that law should be public, and that power should be accountable left a lasting legacy. Punishment was not hidden behind palace walls. It belonged to the people. In the Athenian Empire, justice was both a strength and a vulnerability. It bound citizens together, but it could also be swayed by fear, anger, or ambition. Punishment reflected the values and tensions of a society struggling to balance freedom with control. Number 8. Inca Empire. High in the Andes Mountains of South America, the Inca Empire rose as one of the most highly organized and tightly controlled states of the ancient world. Known to its people as Tawantinsuyu, the land of 4 regions, the empire stretched across thousands of miles, from modern-day Colombia to Chile. Despite lacking writing systems, iron tools, or wheeled transport, the Incas governed millions of people through an extraordinary system of administration, discipline, and punishment. Inca society was built on order. Everything had its place: land, labor, family, religion, and authority. Crime was not viewed as a private matter between individuals. It was a disruption of harmony that threatened the stability of the entire empire. Punishment, therefore, was strict, efficient, and designed to prevent disorder before it could spread. At the top of the system stood the Sapa Inca, the emperor, believed to be the living descendant of the sun god Inti. His authority was absolute. Beneath him operated a vast hierarchy of officials who enforced imperial law across distant provinces. Justice flowed downward from the emperor, carried out by administrators who monitored communities with remarkable precision. The Incas are often remembered for a simple moral code: do not steal, do not lie, do not be lazy. These principles formed the foundation of Inca law. Violating them was considered both a legal and moral failure. Laziness, in particular, was treated as a serious offense. In a society where survival depended on collective labor, refusing to work endangered everyone. Punishment in the Inca Empire was swift and decisive. There were no long trials, no prisons meant for long-term confinement. Investigations were conducted by officials who knew their communities well. Guilt or innocence was often quickly determined. Once a judgment was made, punishment followed without delay. For minor offenses, punishment could involve public reprimand, increased labor duties, or loss of privileges. Public shame played an important role. Being exposed as a lawbreaker in front of one's community served as a powerful deterrent. Reputation mattered deeply in Inca society, where identity was tied to family and communal contribution. Forced labor was one of the most common punishments. Labor was already a central obligation of all citizens through the MTA system, which required people to work on state projects such as roads, terraces, and storehouses. Criminals could be assigned harsher or more dangerous labor as punishment. This reinforced discipline while benefiting the state. For more serious crimes, punishment became far more severe. Theft from state storehouses, rebellion, repeated offenses, or crimes against imperial authority were treated with zero tolerance. Such acts were seen as direct threats to the emperor and the gods. Punishment in these cases was meant to eliminate danger and deter others. Military discipline in the Inca Empire was strict. Soldiers were expected to obey commands absolutely. Cowardice, desertion, or failure in duty undermined the empire's ability to defend itself. Military punishment reinforced loyalty and ensured cohesion among forces drawn from many different ethnic groups. Religion played a central role in Inca justice. Because the Sapa Inca was considered divine, crimes against the state were also crimes against the gods. Punishment carried religious meaning. Maintaining order was a sacred responsibility. Lawbreakers were believed to endanger divine favor, risking natural disasters or crop failure. Children were educated early in discipline and obedience. Elders and officials monitored behavior closely. Communities were organized in units where everyone was accountable to one another. This system of mutual surveillance reduced crime and reinforced conformity. Punishment did not rely on secrecy. It relied on visibility and shared responsibility. One of the most remarkable aspects of Inca justice was its efficiency. Without written records, officials used memory, knotted cords known as quipu, and strict administrative routines to track populations and obligations. Crime was difficult to hide. The system discouraged wrongdoing through certainty of punishment rather than randomness or terror. To modern observers, Inca punishment may appear harsh and unforgiving. Individual freedom was limited. There was little room for dissent or deviation. Yet the system created stability across a vast and diverse empire, allowing the Incas to govern millions with relatively few soldiers. The Inca Empire did not seek to rehabilitate criminals in the modern sense. Its goal was prevention and harmony. Punishment reminded every person that survival depended on obedience, labor, and respect for authority. Justice was not negotiable. It was a function of imperial order. In the Inca world, punishment was inseparable from duty. Law existed to protect the collective, not the individual. Through discipline, surveillance, and swift enforcement, the empire maintained control over some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Number 9. Olmec civilization. Long before great empires rose in the Americas, before the Aztecs and the Maya reached their heights, the Olmec civilization laid the foundations of complex society in Mesoamerica. Emerging along the humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast around 1500 BCE, The Olmecs are often called the mother culture of the region, yet much of their world remains hidden, including how they understood law, authority, and punishment. Unlike later civilizations, the Olmecs left no written legal codes. What we know comes from archaeology, monumental art, and careful interpretation. Justice in the Olmec world was not separated into courts, laws, and officials as it would be in later societies. Instead, punishment appears to have been deeply connected to religion, ritual authority, and social hierarchy. Olmec society was ruled by powerful elites, often interpreted as priest-kings or sacred rulers. These leaders controlled religious ceremonies, trade networks, and political authority. Their power was not based on popular consent or written law, but on spiritual legitimacy. To disobey the ruler was not merely to break a rule, it was to challenge sacred order. In this context, crime was likely defined as behavior that disrupted ritual balance, offended the gods, or threatened elite authority. Theft, defiance, or violation of sacred customs would have been viewed not as private wrongdoing, but as dangers to the entire community. Punishment existed to restore harmony, not to debate guilt in a legal sense. Religion dominated Olmec life, and punishment likely reflected this dominance. Ritual correction may have been as important as physical consequence. Offenders may have been required to perform labor, offerings, or acts of submission meant to appease supernatural forces. Authority was reinforced through symbolism rather than written judgment. Public display played a significant role in Olmec power. Monumental stone heads, ceremonial centers, and ritual spaces were constant reminders of elite control. Punishment, when applied, was likely visible and symbolic. Shame and loss of status were powerful tools in a society where identity was closely tied to community and ritual participation. Social rank likely determined the severity of punishment. Elites and commoners did not live under equal expectations. A noble's wrongdoing may have been treated as a spiritual failure with serious consequences, while commoners may have faced labor obligations or exclusion. Justice was hierarchical, reflecting the structure of society itself. Because the Olmecs lacked prisons or formal courts, punishment was probably swift and final. There is little evidence of long-term confinement. Control was maintained through belief, tradition, and fear of divine consequences rather than continuous enforcement. Violence, when used, was likely ritualized. Punishment may have been embedded in ceremonies that reinforced cosmic order. These acts served to remind the community that authority was sacred and resistance carried consequences beyond the human world. Children would have been raised within this belief system from an early age. Obedience, respect for ritual, and submission to authority were taught as necessities for survival. Punishment reinforced lessons already embedded in religion and daily life. To modern observers, Olmec justice appears mysterious and indirect. There are no trial records, no legal texts, no clear descriptions of punishment. Yet the civilization endured for centuries, suggesting that its system of control was effective. Order was maintained not through constant force, but through shared belief in sacred authority. The Olmecs demonstrate one of the earliest forms of punishment in the Americas, not as law, but as ritual power. Justice was not argued or debated. It was accepted as part of the natural and supernatural order. In the Olmec world, punishment was less about correcting crime and more about preserving balance. Authority flowed from the gods through the ruler, and discipline ensured that society remained aligned with forces believed to govern life itself. Number 10. Mississippian culture. Across the river valleys and fertile plains of what is now the southeastern and midwestern United States, the Mississippian culture developed one of the most complex societies in pre-Columbian North America. Flourishing between roughly 800 and 1600 CE, these societies built large ceremonial cities, massive earthen mounds, and far-reaching trade networks. Although they left no written records, archaeology reveals a world governed by hierarchy, ritual authority, and carefully enforced social order. Mississippian societies were not unified under a single empire. Instead, they were organized into powerful chiefdoms, each centered around a major settlement. At the top of each chiefdom stood a paramount chief, whose authority combined political power, military leadership, and religious significance. Law and punishment flowed from this authority, shaped by tradition rather than written codes. Justice in the Mississippian world was communal and hierarchical. Crime was not seen primarily as an individual failing, but as a disturbance to social and spiritual balance. Order depended on harmony between people, ancestors, and supernatural forces. When that balance was disrupted, punishment served to restore it. Chiefs ruled by control of resources, ritual power, and public ceremony. Their legitimacy rested on the belief that they maintained cosmic order. Disobedience to the chief was therefore more than rebellion. It was a violation of sacred structure. Punishment reinforced the idea that authority was natural and divinely sanctioned. Common offenses likely included theft, violation of social customs, disrespect toward elites, and failure to fulfill communal obligations. Because Mississippian societies relied heavily on cooperation for agriculture, construction, and defense, refusal to contribute labor or obey communal norms threatened survival. Punishment often took the form of public shaming. Reputation mattered deeply in close-knit communities. Being exposed as a lawbreaker before one's peers carried lasting consequences. Shame reinforced conformity more effectively than constant physical force. Forced labor was another common response to wrongdoing. Large-scale construction projects, including mound building and public works, required organized labor. Offenders could be compelled to contribute additional labor as punishment, reinforcing both discipline and communal productivity. Exile was among the most severe punishments. To be expelled from the community meant losing protection, food security, and identity. In a world without centralized states or safe borders, exile was often a slow death. This punishment underscored how deeply survival depended on belonging. Violence, when used as punishment, was often ritualized and symbolic. Archaeological evidence suggests that punishment could be incorporated into ceremonies designed to reinforce elite power and spiritual authority. These acts were not random. They followed cultural rules that emphasized meaning and deterrence. Religion shaped every aspect of Mississippian justice. The world was believed to be structured into upper, middle, and lower realms, each governed by powerful forces. Chiefs were thought to mediate between these realms. Crime disrupted this balance, and punishment restored it. Justice was therefore both social and cosmic. Children were raised to understand these expectations early. Obedience, respect for elders, and acceptance of hierarchy were taught as essential values. Discipline reinforced lessons learned through ritual, storytelling, and daily life. Unlike later societies, the Mississippians did not rely on prisons or permanent legal institutions. Punishment was immediate and embedded within community life. The certainty of consequence mattered more than complexity of procedure. Although Mississippian justice may appear informal by modern standards, it was effective. These societies endured for centuries, managing large populations without written law, police forces, or standing armies. Order was maintained through shared belief, ritual authority, and visible consequences. To modern observers, Mississippian punishment may seem opaque, even harsh. Yet within their worldview, it was necessary. Justice preserved harmony, reinforced leadership, and ensured survival in a demanding environment. In the Mississippian world, punishment was not about control for its own sake. It was about balance. Every consequence reminded the community that order depended on respect for tradition, authority, and the unseen forces believed to govern life itself. Number 11. Persian, Achaemenid, Empire. The Persian Empire emerged in the ancient Near East as one of the largest and most administratively sophisticated empires the world had yet seen. Founded in the 6th century BCE by Cyrus the Great, the Achaemenid Empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Mediterranean. Governing such immense and diverse lands required not only military strength, but a carefully balanced system of law, authority, and punishment. Unlike empires that ruled primarily through fear, The Persian state sought stability through order, tolerance, and predictable justice. Punishment existed not to terrorize the population, but to protect imperial unity. The Persians understood that an empire of many peoples could not survive if it relied solely on brutality. His power was absolute, yet it was exercised through a complex administrative system. The empire was divided into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap. These officials oversaw taxation, security, and justice, but they were carefully monitored to prevent corruption or rebellion. Persian law was influenced by tradition, royal decree, and moral principles rooted in Zoroastrian belief. Truth, order, and justice were considered sacred. Crime was viewed as a form of disorder that threatened both the empire and the cosmic balance upheld by the gods. Punishment, therefore, carried moral weight as well as political purpose. Unlike many ancient societies, the Persian Empire often allowed subject peoples to retain their own laws and customs. Local courts handled most crimes according to regional traditions, so long as imperial authority was respected. This flexibility reduced rebellion and fostered loyalty. However, crimes against the empire itself were treated with absolute seriousness. Rebellion, treason, tax evasion, and conspiracy against the king were considered among the gravest offenses. Such crimes were seen not only as political acts, but as moral betrayals of order. Punishment in these cases was decisive and unmistakable, intended to deter resistance across vast distances. For ordinary crimes such as theft, fraud, or violence, punishment could involve fines, corporal punishment, forced labor, or exile. The severity often depended on intent, status, and repetition. Persian justice emphasized proportionality more than spectacle. While punishment could be severe, it was not typically arbitrary. Public punishment existed, but it was not the central feature of Persian control. The empire relied more on certainty than terror. People were expected to know the law and the consequences of violating it. This predictability reinforced trust in imperial authority. The Persian military maintained its own strict system of discipline. Soldiers were expected to obey orders and remain loyal to the king. Desertion, mutiny, or betrayal endangered imperial security and were punished harshly. Discipline ensured cohesion among troops drawn from many cultures and regions. Religion shaped Persian ideas of justice profoundly. Zoroastrian thought emphasized the struggle between truth and falsehood. A criminal was not merely someone who broke the law, but someone who chose disorder over truth. Punishment, therefore, was seen as a way to restore moral balance. One notable feature of Persian rule was the concept of royal mercy. Kings could reduce sentences or pardon offenders, especially when mercy strengthened loyalty or stability. Cyrus the Great became famous for this approach, earning a reputation as a just ruler rather than a tyrant. Mercy, however, did not replace authority. It reinforced it. Corruption among officials was itself a serious crime. Satraps who abused power or exploited the population could be punished by the king. This oversight helped maintain trust in imperial governance and prevented local tyranny from undermining central control. Family and community also played a role in Persian justice. Reputation mattered, and dishonor could follow an offender for life. Shame and loss of status reinforced formal punishment, especially among elites. To modern observers, Persian punishment appears restrained compared to some ancient empires. Yet this restraint was strategic. The Achaemenid Empire survived not because it punished more cruelly, but because it punished more wisely. Law supported authority, and authority supported stability. In the Persian Empire, punishment was not the foundation of power. It was one of its tools. Order was maintained through administration, tolerance, and moral legitimacy. Justice reminded subjects that the empire stood for balance, not chaos. Punishment, when applied, served a clear purpose: to protect a vast and diverse world held together under one king and one idea of order. Number 12. Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire rose in the ancient Near East as one of the most feared and militarized states the world had ever known. Centered in Mesopotamia with capitals such as Ashur, Nineveh, and Nimrud, Assyria dominated large parts of the Middle East between roughly the 14th and 7th centuries BCE. Its power was built on conquest, intimidation, and a highly organized system of control. Punishment lay at the very heart of Assyrian rule. Unlike empires that sought legitimacy through tolerance or shared law, Assyria ruled through calculated fear. The Assyrians believed that terror was an effective political weapon. Punishment was not only about correcting crime, it was about preventing resistance before it began. Justice served the empire's military objectives above all else. At the top of Assyrian society stood the king, viewed as the chosen agent of the gods on earth. His authority was absolute. Law flowed directly from royal power, supported by divine sanction. To disobey the king was not merely a political crime, but a religious offense. Punishment reinforced the idea that Assyrian rule was inevitable and unstoppable. The Assyrian legal system was harsh and uncompromising. Crimes against the state, such as rebellion, conspiracy, refusal to pay tribute, or resistance to Assyrian authority, were punished with extreme severity. These punishments were often carried out publicly and deliberately recorded in inscriptions and reliefs. The empire wanted its enemies to know exactly what awaited them. Public punishment served a clear strategic purpose. It was meant to intimidate conquered peoples and discourage future uprisings. Assyrian kings openly described the punishments they inflicted on rebels, not as shameful acts, but as achievements. Fear was a language everyone understood. Within Assyrian cities, law enforced strict social order. Theft, fraud, disobedience, and violations of royal or religious authority were punished harshly. Justice favored hierarchy. Elites were protected, while commoners and conquered peoples faced fewer safeguards. The law existed to preserve dominance, not equality. Military discipline was especially strict. The Assyrian army was the most powerful fighting force of its time, and maintaining control over it was essential. Soldiers were expected to obey orders absolutely. Cowardice, desertion, or insubordination threatened imperial strength and were punished without hesitation. Discipline ensured that Assyrian armies remained efficient and ruthless. Religion deeply influenced Assyrian punishment. The Assyrians believed their gods demanded expansion and domination. War itself was sacred. Criminals and rebels were seen as enemies of divine will. Punishment was therefore framed as religious duty. Violence carried spiritual justification. Deportation was one of the Assyrian Empire's most effective tools of punishment and control. Entire populations were forcibly relocated from rebellious regions to distant parts of the empire. This shattered local identity, weakened resistance, and allowed the state to repopulate strategic areas. Deportation punished rebellion while strengthening imperial administration. Unlike later empires, Assyria did not prioritize rehabilitation or integration through law. Control mattered more than loyalty. Punishment was meant to break resistance, not reform behavior. Submission was the desired outcome. Despite its brutality, Assyrian punishment was not random. It followed patterns designed to maximize fear and efficiency. Cities that surrendered peacefully were often spared the worst consequences. Those that resisted were punished severely. The message was clear. Obedience brought survival, resistance brought destruction. Within the empire, fear maintained order. People obeyed not because they trusted the law, but because they understood the consequences of defiance. Justice was swift, final, and terrifyingly predictable. To modern observers, Assyrian punishment appears extreme and inhumane. Yet within the Assyrian worldview, it was necessary. The empire existed in a constant state of war. Survival depended on dominance. Mercy was seen as weakness. Ironically, the same system that made Assyria powerful also made it fragile. Rule by fear created obedience, but not loyalty. When Assyria weakened, subject peoples rose against it. The empire collapsed rapidly in the late 7th century BCE, destroyed by those it had long terrorized. The Assyrian Empire demonstrates the limits of punishment as a foundation of power. Fear can conquer, but it cannot sustain unity forever. Justice based solely on terror leaves no room for forgiveness, trust, or renewal. In Assyria, punishment was not hidden. It was carved in stone, proclaimed by kings, and etched into memory. It was the language of empire, loud, violent, and unmistakable. Number 13. Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire rose in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, as one of the earliest civilizations to place law at the center of state power. Long before Rome or Persia, Babylon developed a vision of justice that was formal, written, and deliberately enforced. In Babylon, punishment was not merely an act of authority. It was a statement that law itself ruled society. Babylon reached its greatest influence under King Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE. Unlike many rulers who governed through custom or divine mystery, Hammurabi presented himself as a lawgiver. He claimed that the gods had chosen him to bring justice to the land, protect the weak, and destroy wrongdoing. Punishment, therefore, was both a royal duty and a sacred responsibility. At the heart of Babylonian justice stood written law. The famous Code of Hammurabi, carved into stone and displayed publicly, listed hundreds of laws covering property, trade, family life, labor, and crime. This was revolutionary. Law was no longer hidden in tradition or memory. It was visible, fixed, and known. Punishment was predictable, not arbitrary. Crime in Babylon was defined as a violation of legal order. Theft, fraud, assault, false accusation, negligence, adultery, and rebellion were all carefully categorized. Each offense carried a specific punishment. Babylonian justice aimed for clarity. People were expected to understand the law, and ignorance was not an excuse. Punishment in the Babylonian system was strict and often severe, but it followed clear rules. One of its guiding principles was proportionality, the idea that punishment should match the offense. This concept is often summarized by the phrase, "an eye for an eye," though in practice the system was more complex. The goal was balance, not chaos. Social status played a major role in Babylonian punishment. Society was divided into classes, and the law treated them differently. Crimes committed by or against elites carried different consequences than those involving commoners or enslaved people. Justice was legal, but not equal. The law protected hierarchy as much as order. Public punishment reinforced authority. Because laws were carved in stone and punishments widely known, enforcement carried symbolic power. When punishment was carried out, it reminded the population that the law was real, permanent, and backed by the state. Fear existed, but it was fear of law, not fear of unpredictability. Judges played a central role in Babylonian justice. They were expected to apply the law accurately and honestly. Corruption among judges was itself a serious crime, punished harshly. This reinforced trust in the legal system and emphasized that law, not personal power, governed Babylonian society. Family law was especially important in Babylon. Marriage, inheritance, parenthood, and household authority were strictly regulated. Punishment enforced social stability within the family, which Babylonian rulers viewed as the foundation of the state. Disorder at home was believed to lead to disorder in society. Religion shaped Babylonian punishment deeply. Laws were presented as divinely sanctioned. Crime offended both the state and the gods. Punishment restored balance not only among people, but between humanity and the divine order. Justice had cosmic significance. Unlike later empires, Babylon did not rely heavily on long-term imprisonment. Punishment was immediate and definitive. Compensation, physical punishment, exile, or death were used to resolve offenses quickly. Justice was not about rehabilitation. It was about restoring balance and preventing repetition. Military discipline also followed legal principles. Soldiers who disobeyed orders or betrayed the state faced punishment defined by law. Loyalty was enforced not by emotion, but by clear consequence. To modern observers, Babylonian punishment may appear harsh and rigid. Individual circumstances mattered less than legal clarity. Yet this rigidity created stability. People knew what was expected and what would happen if they failed. The Babylonian Empire demonstrated one of history's earliest attempts to replace personal revenge with structured justice. Law stood above individuals. Punishment was no longer a private act. It was a public institution. In Babylon, punishment was not simply an expression of power. It was the embodiment of law itself, carved in stone, backed by the gods, and enforced by the king. Justice was meant to endure beyond any single ruler, shaping society through order, balance, and consequence. The Babylonian Empire stands as one of the earliest civilizations to place law and punishment at the very center of society. Rising in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Babylon developed in a land where agriculture, trade, and urban life demanded order. Unlike societies ruled primarily by custom or fear, Babylon sought to govern through written law, enforced by royal authority and justified by divine will. Babylon reached its greatest prominence during the reign of King Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE. Hammurabi did not present himself merely as a conqueror or warrior king. He portrayed himself as a guardian of justice, chosen by the gods to bring order to the land. In his vision, punishment was not personal revenge, but a sacred duty meant to protect society from chaos. The most famous expression of Babylonian justice is the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest surviving legal texts in human history. Carved into stone and placed in public view, the code listed hundreds of laws governing nearly every aspect of life. Property disputes, trade agreements, family relations, labor obligations, violence, and theft were all regulated. Punishment was not hidden or negotiable. It was known in advance. This public nature of law was revolutionary. In Babylon, justice did not depend entirely on memory, tradition, or the mood of a ruler. Law was fixed and visible. People were expected to know it. Crime was defined clearly as a violation of legal order rather than a personal offense alone. Punishment in Babylon was strict and often severe, but it followed a principle of proportionality. The idea that punishment should match the offense shaped Babylonian law. While often summarized as an eye for an eye, the system was more detailed and structured. The goal was balance, restoring order by matching consequence to wrongdoing. However, Babylonian justice was not equal for all. Society was divided into social classes, and punishment reflected this hierarchy. The same crime could receive different penalties depending on whether the offender or victim was an elite, a commoner, or an enslaved person. Law preserved social structure as much as it preserved order. Judges were central to the Babylonian system. They were expected to interpret and apply the law correctly. Corruption among judges was treated as a serious crime, sometimes punished more harshly than the original offense. This reinforced the idea that justice itself was sacred and must not be compromised. Public punishment reinforced the authority of law. When penalties were carried out, they reminded society that the law was permanent and unavoidable. Fear existed, but it was fear of certainty, not unpredictability. Babylonian rulers understood that consistency was a powerful tool of control. Family life was heavily regulated. Marriage, inheritance, adultery, and parental authority were all governed by law. Punishment ensured stability within households, which Babylonian rulers viewed as the foundation of the state. Disorder in the family was believed to lead to disorder in society. Religion deeply influenced Babylonian punishment. Laws were presented as divinely inspired. Crime was not only an offense against society, but against the gods themselves. Punishment restored harmony between humans and the divine order. Justice had cosmic importance. Unlike later societies, Babylon did not rely on prisons for long-term punishment. Justice was immediate and decisive. Compensation, corporal punishment, exile, or execution resolved crimes quickly. The purpose was deterrence and balance, not rehabilitation. Military discipline followed the same legal principles. Disobedience, betrayal, or failure of duty threatened the state and was punished accordingly. Loyalty to the king and the law was essential to survival. To modern eyes, Babylonian punishment may appear rigid and harsh. Individual circumstances mattered less than legal clarity. Yet this rigidity created stability. People knew the rules, the consequences, and the limits of acceptable behavior. The Babylonian Empire represents one of humanity's earliest attempts to replace personal vengeance with institutional justice. Law stood above individuals, including the ruler himself. Punishment became a function of the state, not private revenge. In Babylon, punishment was not simply an act of power. It was the expression of law, morality, and divine order combined. Justice was carved in stone, enforced by authority, and meant to endure beyond any single king, shaping society through order, balance, and consequence. Number 14. Hittite Empire. The Hittite Empire emerged in ancient Anatolia as a powerful state that governed through law, diplomacy, and controlled force rather than constant terror. Rising around the 17th century BCE, the Hittites built an empire that rivaled Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. Unlike many of their contemporaries, the Hittites developed a system of punishment that emphasized legal responsibility and compensation, revealing a distinctive approach to justice in the ancient world. Hittite society was ruled by a king, but his authority was not unlimited. The king was bound by law and tradition, and in many cases legal decisions were recorded and preserved. Punishment was not merely an expression of royal anger, it was part of a recognized legal framework. This made Hittite justice unusually restrained by ancient standards. Crime in the Hittite world was defined as an offense against social order rather than a purely moral or religious failing. Theft, assault, damage to property, sexual offenses, and disobedience were all addressed by law. The purpose of punishment was to restore balance within society, not simply to eliminate the offender. One of the most striking features of Hittite punishment was its emphasis on compensation over execution. Many crimes that carried death sentences in other empires were punished in the Hittite system with fines, restitution, or labor. Offenders were often required to compensate victims with goods, land, or service. This approach reduced cycles of revenge and preserved social stability. Social status still mattered. Nobles, commoners, and enslaved people were treated differently under the law. However, even elites could be punished if they violated legal norms. Law existed to protect hierarchy, but it also placed limits on abuse of power. Public punishment existed, but it was not the central feature of Hittite justice. The empire relied more on certainty of consequence than spectacle. Legal texts clearly outlined penalties, allowing people to understand the risks of wrongdoing. Predictability reinforced obedience. Religion influenced punishment, but less aggressively than in Assyria or Babylon. Crimes against temples or sacred property were treated seriously, yet justice focused more on social harm than divine anger. The gods were guardians of order, not constant executioners. Military discipline was firm but structured. Soldiers who disobeyed orders, deserted, or betrayed the state were punished according to law. Discipline ensured loyalty without relying entirely on fear. This allowed the Hittite army to remain effective across long campaigns. The Hittites were also notable for their diplomatic mindset. Treaties were sacred legal documents, and breaking them was considered a serious crime. Punishment for violating treaties reinforced the importance of law between states, not just within them. Justice extended beyond borders. Family law was carefully regulated. Marriage, inheritance, and household authority were protected through legal rules. Punishment reinforced stability within families, which the Hittites viewed as the foundation of the state. To modern observers, Hittite punishment may appear unusually lenient for the ancient world. However, this restraint was strategic. By favoring restitution over destruction, the empire maintained productivity and loyalty. Justice preserved society rather than exhausting it. The Hittite legal system reveals an alternative ancient model of punishment, one based not on terror or divine violence, but on law as balance. Authority was enforced, but measured. Order was maintained through clarity rather than fear alone. In the Hittite Empire, punishment was a tool of stability. It reminded society that wrongdoing had consequences, but also that law existed to preserve life, order, and continuity. Justice was firm, structured, and enduring, a legacy that set the Hittites apart in the ancient world. When we look across these ancient empires, one question naturally rises above all others. Whose discipline and punishment were the most difficult to endure? Was it Sparta, where weakness itself was treated as a crime and honor mattered more than life? Was it Assyria, where punishment was deliberately used as a weapon of fear to crush resistance? Or perhaps the Aztec world, where law, religion, and punishment were inseparable, and justice carried cosmic meaning? Some may argue that Rome's public and unequal punishments left the deepest mark, while others may believe that the Inca system, with its constant surveillance and zero tolerance for disorder, was the hardest to live under. Each society punished in its own way, some through fear, some through law, some through shame, and some through absolute control. What they all shared was the belief that order was more important than mercy. Now, we want to hear from you. Which empire do you think had the most difficult discipline or punishment system? And why? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey through ancient justice, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history.